Hello, everyone. On this channel, we've referred to the policies of American President Donald Trump as fascistic, and we supplied a definition to explain what we meant. Encyclopedia Britannica defines fascism as extreme militaristic nationalism, contempt for electoral democracy and political and cultural liberalism, a belief in natural social hierarchy and the rule of elites, and the desire to create a people's community in which individual interests would be subordinated to the good of the nation. We discussed how Trump met every point of that definition, and today we're going to discuss a related concept called post-fascism. So let's jump right in. In 2024, Italian historian Enzo Traverso authored the crisis and critique paper Post-Fascism, Fascism as Trans-Historical Concept. Traverso says in the abstract that post-fascism, embodied by Donald Trump and his mega party in the US, quote, ostentatiously exhibits typical fascist features. Authoritarian and charismatic leadership, hatred of democracy, contempt for law, derision of human rights, open racism, notably against blacks, Latinos, and Muslims, misogynism, homophobia, but the old fascist rhetoric has been abandoned. The post-fascist movements depict themselves as defenders of national identities threatened by globalization, mass immigration, and Islamic fundamentalism. A hybrid phenomenon, this post-fascism is neither the reproduction of the old fascism nor something wholly new. It remains in suspension between an unknown future and a haunting past. Close quote. To get at what exactly post-fascism is and its relationship to classical fascism, we first need to talk about one of the bugbears of modern conservatism: identity politics. Identity politics refers to an enormous range of political activities that have the ultimate goal of securing more freedom and self-determination for some marginalized group or groups. The examples in the US that tend to get thrown around are the civil rights for Black Americans, the feminist and Native American movements, and more recently, LGBT liberation. As we saw in The Right Way is a Myth, many historical injustices have been committed against Native Americans and Black people, so there's a lot of work to be done. But no sooner had the phrase come to refer to consciousness-raising movements that sought to end oppression than it became a political punching bag for ideologues anxious to find targets and scapegoats, and it was accompanied by propagandistic dog whistles aimed to inflame and motivate their supporting audience. Though the usage of the phrase did not really come into existence until the late 1970s, its arrival was essentially simultaneous with being used as an insult. Identity politics is derided as capturing, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, quote, a form of virtue signaling that unfairly privileges women and racialized people at the expense of white men while inhibiting freedom of expression or, especially in extra academic political discourse, simply a kind of unspecified defense of interest groups that undermines nation building, cultural cohesion, or tradition, close quote. To critics, identity politics undermines political liberalism, even though identity politics is ostensibly about liberating groups downtrodden by historical and structural inequalities caused by colonialism, xenophobia, and homophobia. In the US, the right-wing political party rails against identity politics, but of course, the right has its own identity politics: far-right populism and Christian nationalism. Again, citing the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, one source defines populism as, quote, a worldview that divides the polity into a pure people and a corrupt elite, shrugs off the trappings of liberal democracy as a ruse of that elite, and prefers a nationalist authoritarian politics driven by hostility to minorities and to pluralism in general, close quote. This type of identity politics tracks closely the obsessions of conservative American creationism, arguing in favor of white supremacism, misogyny, eugenics, and homophobia. American political scientist Francis Fukuyama argues that in the 21st century, the left focuses, quote, less on creating broad economic equality and more on promoting the interests of a wide variety of marginalized groups, such as ethnic minorities, immigrants and refugees, women, and LGBT people. The right, meanwhile, has redefined its core mission as the patriotic protection of traditional national identity, which is often explicitly connected to race, ethnicity, or religion, close quote. Post-fascism, then, is an outgrowth, a more extreme version of far-right populism. And I want to take one more brief detour. I don't like the word post-fascism. Traverso defends the word by saying it, quote, emphasizes a chronological distance and locates what is happening today in a historical sequence shaped by both continuity and transformation, close quote. I, however, want to offer an alternative that captures the same spirit, but instead recognizes the resurgence of our modern version of fascism, a word which was used by Italian writer and director Pier Paolo Pasolini in a 1974 essay. Neo-Fascism. Neo is a Greek prefix meaning new, and whereas the prefix post seems to me to indicate that we are past fascism, for instance, post-mortem means after death, neo-fascism highlights that we are dealing with a new version of fascism. For that reason, I will use neo-fascism instead of post-fascism for the remainder of this video. Coming back to Traverso, he begins by noting that the world has been experiencing a resurgence of far-right nationalist political ideology in the last decade, with Donald Trump in the United States, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Marine Le Pen in France, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Narendra Modi in India, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, and Recep Erdogan in Turkey. Even though Bolsonaro was defeated by Lula da Silva in the 2023 presidential election, Bolsonaro still enjoys wide support in Brazil. According to a 2024 Pew Research Center poll, 40% of Brazilians hold a favorable view of Bolsonaro. Traverso notes that now seems like a good time to revisit the concept of fascism and ask if it adequately captures the political positions of modern far-right politicians. Traverso makes historical comparisons between populist leaders to shed light on the relationship between populism and neo-fascism. First, Silvio Berlusconi was the Prime Minister of Italy from 1994 to 1995, 2001 to 2006, and 2008 to 2011. Traverso writes, quote, and 10 years ago, many historians who tried to interpret Berlusconi's Italy recognized its intimacy, if not its filiation, with classical fascism. Of course, there were enormous differences between the founder of a totalitarian state and a successful businessman who owned several TV channels, but Berlusconi's plebiscitary conception of democracy and charismatic leadership strongly evoked the fascist archetype. And Berlusconi was a modest forerunner of Donald Trump, close quote. The February 16th, 2021 Atlantic article, What History Tells Us Will Happen to Trumpism by Yasmin Serhan, says on Berlusconi, quote, though his career of more than 2 decades has been dogged by scandals, investigations, and trials, evidence, Berlusconi claimed in 2009 that he is the most persecuted person in history, he has nonetheless remained a political force since his most recent resignation from the premiership in 2011, both within his center-right Forza Italia party, of which he remains leader, as well as in national politics more broadly. But perhaps Berlusconi's greatest success has been his ability to retain his base of loyal supporters, a personality cult that continues to see him as akin to a god. Close quote. Second, Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori governed his country from 1990 to 2000, and a cult of personality sprang up around him too. He shut down Peru's Congress in 1992 via the military. He embezzled billions of dollars worth of public funds. He had suspected insurgents arrested and tried with few to no legal rights. He allowed the Peruvian army to destroy villages and murder farmers. He ordered a Peruvian death squad in 1991 to murder 15 people, including an 8-year-old in the Barrios Altos massacre. He authorized the kidnapping and murder of 9 students and a professor from the National University of Education Enrique Guzman y Valle, and the list goes on. Nevertheless, as the 2008 Law and Business Review of the Americas article, former Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori's extradition process by Patricio Noboa notes, quote, to his supporters, Mr. Fujimori is the man who saved Peru from the twin evils of terrorism and economic collapse. Thus, he is remembered with gratitude by some of the Peruvian population for crushing the Shining Path guerrillas, stabilizing the economy by overcoming hyperinflation, and building schools and clinics in remote Andean towns, close quote. The third populist Serhan mentions is Juan Perón of Argentina, who served as president from 1946 to 1955 and 1973 to 1974. Even though Perón was brought to power through democratic means, Serhan says, quote, like other populists, Perón became more and more authoritarian over the course of his rule, jailing his political opponents, vilifying the media, and restricting constitutional rights. By 1955, after nearly a decade in power, Perón was deposed in a coup and sent into exile in Spain. His party was banned. Close quote. Peronism, which was the movement that grew around Perón, was defined by economic independence, pushes for social justice, and the non-interference of foreign powers in domestic affairs. So, populism tends to involve charismatic leaders drumming up support for nationalist policies, i.e., those that build and maintain a single national or cultural identity, and often using authoritarian measures like sending in the military to achieve those goals. The shift from run of the mill populism to neo-fascism then involves the generation of a mythic national origin narrative and the ramping up of divisive rhetoric and later actions, separating good citizens from evil ones. Traverso notes the similarities between modern right-wing politicians and classical fascists. Quote, the global chaos of the 1920s and 30s depended on the collapse of the 19th century European concert, whereas nowadays it results from the end of the Cold War and its bipolar world. As we know, international instability always raises the demand for strong men. Sometimes the entanglement of crisis and instability produces events that turn into tragic repetitions. Think of the refugee crisis of 2015, which recalls the Evian Conference of 1938, when Western democracies concluded they would not receive the Jews who fled from Nazi Germany. Close quote. Despite these similarities, though, there are a number of differences between classical fascism and neo-fascism. For starters, neo-fascists typically do not openly call for violence against people within their own country. Usually, violence is exported to poorer countries. Iran, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. Of course, that's changing as Trump is ramping up detaining and deporting immigrants without due process, pardoning all of the January 6th mob that stormed the Capitol, and creating a well-funded but increasingly unaccountable ICE private army. Information distortion and suppression is integral to Trump 2.0, as partisans were brought into the federal government where they illegally deleted Department of Defense pages that highlighted the heroic actions of Black Americans, women, and LGBT people in the military. Humorously, all those pages had to go back up per a court order. A second difference is anti-communism. Classical fascism was obsessed with opposing communism, but with the fall of the, at least communist by name, USSR, there are essentially no communist countries on the world stage. That doesn't stop right-wing pundits from referring to cultural Marxism, and Trump and many of his supporters freely use communists to describe those they target, including the newly elected mayor of New York City. That rhetoric plays into what is itself an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that refers to any ideas conservatives don't like, though cultural Marxism is nowhere near the rallying cry in the 21st century that anti-communism was in the 20th. There's no McCarthyism for cultural Marxism. Well, with the exception of groups like Turning Point USA making a professor watch list for those who dare to talk about race or gender, normal aspects of biology you should probably know about, and libs of TikTok outing teachers for being gay or trans. 1950s McCarthyism built on decades of conservative watch lists done by groups opposed to civil rights or liberalized social norms, including intimidating Hollywood studios of the period to avoid issues that might offend their constituents, especially racial equality. As for today's guardians of other people's virtue, one might think that the so-called free speech warriors like the late Charlie Kirk are being blatantly hypocritical here until one realizes that free speech doesn't mean free speech for you, it only means free speech for them. At any rate, Traverso points out that right-wing parties became focused on other priorities following the defeat of classical fascism, at times ambivalent about expanding free trade neoliberal policies, but definitely keen on privatizing the federally funded social safety net. By leaning heavily into deregulation, the right wing could grow more powerful without appearing subversive to mainstream culture. Slovenian sociologist Rasko Machnik wrote in the 2017 paper Beyond Fascism, Historical Parallels and Structural Specificities of Post-Socialism. The double international and national economic crises of the 1980s forced socialist countries to accumulate huge foreign debts. The debt crisis was a global phenomenon, since private creditors possessed enormous quantities of petroleum money and encouraged governments to contract debts they were later unable to honor. Already at that time, sovereign debt was the preferred mode of investment, since the profit rate in core areas was declining, as were capital gains in general. Inability to pay back the debt forced socialist countries to seek assistance from the International Monetary Fund, already the instrument of global capital. The IMF made its assistance contingent upon the introduction of neoliberal reforms. In socialist countries, this meant the destruction of the socialist project, the restoration of capitalism, and for the great majority of the population, precipitous decreases in standard of living and general life security. Specifically in Yugoslavia, neoliberal policies imposed by the IMF were particularly ruinous as they were one of the main pressures towards the destruction of the Federation. In these countries, the IMF imposed austerity measures to pay foreign debt, required centralization of the economy to concentrate the value that was to be exported towards the creditors, in which strengthened labor discipline, and introduced profit seeking as the main entrepreneurial objective. The ensuing increase of exploitation intensified workers' resistance against the fragmented ruling bureaucracies, which, in response to the double pressures from working people and from international organizations, formed new coalitions by which to conduct the restoration of capitalism. As in Weimar Germany, the ruling groups searched for allies in the most reactionary groupuscules, those who would assist them to repress popular upheavals and would transform the modes of oppression and exploitation. In Yugoslavia, the recomposition of the ruling political and cultural bureaucracies, together with managerial technocrats who followed the political fraction, took a particular form which pioneered post-socialist fascist-like politics. Since the early 1950s, bureaucracies of the ideological apparatus, institutionalized by federal republics, have buttressed their domination with a belles lettres-centered nationalist ideology. During the restoration of capitalism, cultural bureaucracies merged with the political bureaucracies of particular federal republics. Together, they destroyed the Yugoslav Federation and instituted independent states, which, by their mere existence, institutionalized the ideological conflation of knowledge and belief. The new political cultural ruling groups organized popular support for the restoration of capitalism within the nation-state ideology. However, the constructions they actually established were identitary states that, contrary to the pluralism of the traditional nation-state, practiced internal discipline and control and ethnic intolerance. It then only took some exalted rhetoric volunteered by writers, poets, and dissidents to transpose the fascist potential of this institutional frame into really existing neo-fascism, close quote. All the while, union membership has faded, which in the United States had been one of the main drivers of middle and working class prosperity after World War II. The right wing, in conjunction with transnational organizations like the IMF and World Bank, realized unions were predominantly left wing and could not be brought to heel, so they had to be destroyed. Labor rights have been attacked while the welfare state has been dismantled. The new targets of the right wing are not communists or Jews, at least not publicly usually, but the modern analogs to the groups perceived as threats to the privileges of the old regime: immigrants, Muslims, and black people of the suburbs, the homeless, feminists, LGBTQ, anti-racists, ecologists, and defenders of immigrant rights. Third, the goals of neo-fascism share similarities with classical fascism, but also differ in important ways. While neo-fascism shares with classical fascism the claim of a return to the past, including having national currency, national sovereignty, stopping immigration, the preservation of the Christian roots of Western countries, gender hierarchies, defense of family, and so on, a major difference is that neo-fascism clings to the tradition of cultural despair, rather than embracing a conservative revolution that projected fascistic values onto a future political order. In other words, neo-fascists advocate for shrinking to the past, or at least their contrived version of the past, rather than building toward a glorious future. There is no talk of a 1,000-year Reich or a rebirth of the Roman Empire. This stands in contrast to the recent left-wing movements that have sought to build a more equitable future, such as Occupy Wall Street in the US, 15M in Spain, and La Nuit Debout in France. In his 2025 essay, Recentering the Past in Post-Fascism, Harrison Pates discusses 4 examples of what he calls past-facing rhetoric employed by neo-fascist ideology. They are a return to a supposed golden age, regeneration of the culture as a response to perceived degeneracy, retribution for historical grievances, and selective remembrance of certain parts of a nation's history. Pates makes this argument with respect to British neo-fascistic parties, offshoots of the British National Party like Patriotic Alternative, Combat 18, the English Defence League, and Britain First, as well as mainstream far-right parties like the United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP, and Reform UK. A section of the British National Party's British culture policy includes the statement, quote, "The BNP will protect our unique and precious British identity from mass immigration, multiculturalism, health and safety killjoys, and globalization, close quote, along with the policy to end public funding of organizations advocating multiculturalism. For neo-fascists, the return is a generalized belief in the greatness of traditional social norms that emphasize a white patriarchal society. Regeneration involves the restoration of masculinity, traditionalism, and perceived cultural purity over the destructive forces of what they perceive as degeneracy, such as pacifism, environmentalism, and gender and sexual equality. As for retribution, even though neo-fascists carry grievances about the state of the world, there remain, so far at least, many institutional obstacles standing in the way of state-sanctioned violence, seen in events like the Kristallnacht of Nazi Germany. Although Trump's heavy-handed usage of immigration and customs enforcement agents across many U.S. cities is a worrying parallel. Likewise, many conservatives talk about taking revenge on woke institutions, especially public schools, universities, and museums, by branding and outlawing certain topics as leftist propaganda. Look no further than Republican Florida Governor Ron DeSantis blocking the creation of a public school class on African American history, arts, science, and culture. DeSantis proudly proclaimed that Florida is where woke goes to die. Though DeSantis' Florida Republicans may not have realized there could be a price to be paid for frightening so many people, as Canadian tourism, once the bulwark of seasonal business there, has dried up in 2025, leaving Portugal, Mexico, and the Caribbean to pick up their trade. Making such bad decisions on a national scale, Brexit, or the British exit from the European Union, was pitched as a way to control immigration, to free English culture from globalism, and to encourage British economic and political independence. First, a UK-wide referendum was held on June 23, 2016, with about 52% of the population voting to leave the European Union, and this vote led to almost 4 years of negotiations with the UK leaving the EU in January 2020. Economists rightly predicted that Brexit would harm the British economy. The sterling exchange rate depreciated immediately following the 2016 referendum. As a 2020 Vox EU article writes, quote, "We estimate that the Brexit depreciation increased UK consumer prices by 2.9%. This represents an €870 per year increase in the cost of living for the average UK household, meaning people have to work 1.4 weeks longer to afford the same goods and services," close quote. A survey of some 3,000 UK businesses found that Brexit uncertainty reduced growth and investment by 6 percentage points and employment by 1.5 percentage points, and multiple studies reported reduced British international trade. As it happens, some macroeconomic studies did estimate that immigration would decrease because UK GDP growth is a driver of immigration. However, the hilarious reality was that leaving the EU actually led to more immigration. As the European Parliament think tank pointed out in June 2025, quote, "Leaving the EU in 2016 allowed the UK to implement a points-based system that treats EU citizens and non-EU citizens equally. In the following years, there was a significant increase in the number of migrants arriving in the country. The sharp rise in the number of regular migrants can be attributed to the liberalization of migration laws, making it easier for non-EU migrants to work in the UK, a campaign aimed at attracting more foreign students, and the high number of visas granted to people from Ukraine and Hong Kong on humanitarian grounds. Additionally, there has been a notable shift in the composition of these migrants in terms of age and nationality. Prior to 2016, most migrants came from the EU, but now most come from outside the EU. The UK government has already implemented measures to reduce migration, resulting in fewer arrivals, although it is still attracting more migrants than before Brexit. However, predicting future migration flows is difficult as much depends on external factors. Irregular migration has also significantly increased since the UK's departure from the EU, close quote. So, with Brexit, the UK achieved neither a better economy nor control over immigration. Great job, guys. Pates's last point is the selective remembrance of history to strategically reinforce a particular version of a country's history, one favorable to neo-fascism, of course. British politician Nick Griffin, who headed the British National Party from 1999 to 2014, wrote an article sympathetic to the SS in the Rune magazine in 1995, but later in 2009, Griffin would proclaim that Winston Churchill would belong to the British National Party because he would be against mass immigration and Islam. Churchill, humorously, is a contentious figure for neo-fascists because he was, on the one hand, a dyed-in-the-wool and unabashed colonialist, but on the other hand, he did majorly assist in bringing about the end of the Nazi Party. This latter point became an issue in a recent show by conservative political commentator Tucker Carlson, who interviewed Nazi apologist Daryl Cooper. Cooper claimed that Churchill was the chief villain of World War II instead of, the guy who authorized the invasion of Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg and did the Holocaust. Of course, the point of Griffin trying to reposition Churchill as a supporter of the BNP is to distance himself and his party from its own fascist activities. Pates bitingly notes that the relationship of classical fascists to their claimed historical roots is today, quote, unarticulated as the revolutionary fervor and philosophy of fascism has been subsumed under a rather more mass-produced and neoliberal nothingness of identity, choosing broad categories such as English heritage to facilitate shape-shifting, omnipresent discourse reflecting present events, decisions, and conditions of the modern information landscape, close quote. Back to Traverso, fourth, xenophobia is a common feature of neo-fascism, although in fairness, xenophobia has been common throughout American history, as we saw in The Right Way is a Myth. Hatred and fear of immigrants, illegal or legal ones like the Haitian migrants, are condemned as infiltrating enemies that threaten the health of a national community. Cultural pluralism is rejected in the name of some historically anachronistic monolithic identity. Similar to classical fascism, neo-fascists look for scapegoats upon whom they can blame societal ills, and not a few among the neo-fascists do still blame the Jews, just calling them globalists, cultural Marxists, or some other dog whistle. Think Nick Fuentes, occasional guest at Trump's table, platformed by Tucker Carlson and backhandedly defended by the head of the Project 2025 Heritage Foundation. Islamophobia has been strongly incorporated into neo-fascism following 9/11, and the eugenicist doctrines of classical fascism have been replaced by, to quote Traverso, a cultural prejudice that emphasizes an irreducible discrepancy between Jewish Christian Europe and the Islam world, close quote. Of course, as we discussed in a critique of both sidesism, terrorist attacks in the US overwhelmingly come from right-wing groups rather than left-wing or Islamic ones, but who needs those details? Especially when the Trump State Department can just make those reports go away. As an aside, it's rather humorous that Islamophobia is so rampant in the US given that we were a major destabilizing force in Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. If anyone has a reason to be West-phobic, it's the Muslims. Obviously, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia can exist together. Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, identifies both as a threat, all too consistent with Hungary's record of fascism back in the Hitler era. Traverso describes Orban's reboot as a mixture of enemies. Quote, a financial conspiracy organized by a Jewish elite from Wall Street, the usual target of his speeches is the banker George Soros, and a demographic threat embodied by mass immigration, Islamic invasion, close quote. Seemingly paradoxically, many right-wing politicians who harbor anti-Semitic views or cabinet members are strong supporters of Israel, which they see as fighting back against Islam, though Israel's actions in Gaza have caused waves of anti-Israel sentiment to surface among them. Current Deputy Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Italian anti-immigrant right, both railed against immigrants in mass meetings and organized a conference against anti-Semitism with the Israeli ambassador present. In France, the myth of an Islamic invasion of the West was condensed by French author Renaud Camus into the phrase Le Grand Remplacement, the Great Replacement. The Great Replacement conspiracy is very similar to 19th century anti-Semitism. German historian Heinrich von Treitschke lamented the intrusion of Jews into German society who disrupted the local culture. His despair that the Jews are our unhappiness is startlingly paralleled in Elaine Finkielkraut's 2013 L'identité malheureuse, the unhappy identity, that laments France's modern multiculturalism. One might find that surprising given that Finkielkraut is himself a descendant of Jews who survived the Holocaust. Coming to Donald Trump, one of his favorite slogans is America First, which has a history traceable to the racist and nativist know-nothings of the 1850s, whom we discussed in The Right Way is a Myth. In the early 20th century, America First continued to be used as a shield against mass immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, culminating in the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924 that sharply limited immigration from these regions. The phrase was used again by domestic fascists to rally opposition to the U.S.'s 1941 entry into World War II, but fell out of favor after the defeat of Nazism, only to be resurrected by Trump for his 2016, 2020, and 2024 presidential campaigns. Tying everything back together, we can clearly see that Trump and the MAGA Republican Party embody neo-fascism, so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do next? To answer this question, I'll draw from historian Timothy Snyder's 2017 book, On Tyranny. Snyder tells us not to obey in advance. We must defend institutions. We must beware the one-party state. We must take responsibility for the face of the world. We must remember professional ethics. We must be wary of paramilitaries. We must be reflective if we must be armed. We must stand out. We must be kind to our language. We must believe in truth. We must investigate. We must make eye contact and talk to other members of society. We must practice corporeal politics. We must establish a private life. We must contribute to good causes. We must learn from peers in other countries. We must listen for dangerous words. We must be calm when the unthinkable arrives. We must be patriots. And we must be as courageous as we can. We cannot fall for the politics of inevitability, in which we simply assume that liberal democracy will always prevail or that the authoritarians are unstoppable. Combating neo-fascism, just like combating classical fascism, requires active participation. So, thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next time.